What's up, everyone? How's it going? Happy Thursday. Hope we're all good. Just before we get into it, can you let me know, can you see me okay? Can you hear me okay? And can you see my screen? Because yeah, it's just me on here today. So if you can just give me the thumbs up and let me know, then yeah, we can get into it. I hope everyone's having a good Thursday. And welcome to my first live stream of 2024. So if it's your first time here, oh, perfect. Thanks for the all goods. Cheers, everyone. I appreciate it. So if it's your first time here on one of my live streams, then hi, hello, welcome. So about a year ago, I started doing monthly live streams on the Maxon Training Team YouTube channel. So I'm a trainer for Maxon. I train C4D or Cinema 4D and Redshift mostly. And yeah, I just started doing the last Tuesday of every month, doing like a live project breakdown or a live tutorial. And yeah, I don't plan on stopping. So now you'll notice it's moved to the last Thursday of the month for certain reasons that I will explain, not today, but maybe another time. But yeah, that's the plan. And so welcome to our live stream. So the plan today is we're going to be running through a bit of a project that I posted on socials, and it's actually based off of this designer here. So Vinicius is a designer at Man vs Machine, incredible studio, incredible designer. And he posted this. And so it's some inflation explorations inside of Houdini. And first of all, I thought this looks so cool. It looks amazing. And I thought it would be fun to try and recreate a version using Cinema 4D's, when I say new cloth system, I guess it's not really new anymore, but we'll call it the new one. And we can get kind of close. And so, yeah, shout out to this guy, amazing designer and amazing render in Houdini. And so this is kind of where I managed to get to after having a little bit of a play around. So we can see, it's not too bad, really. Like I'm pretty happy with it. And what's nice about this is we can do this really, really quickly. So my plan is really to keep this live stream under an hour. And so we're going to create the entire thing, including the simulation, and we're going to render it in Redshift, hopefully under that time, which should be good. Cool. So also really quickly, if you want the project file for this, then it is in the description on YouTube. But also, if you want to grab the project file and any other project files from the breakdowns or the live streams that I do, then on my Instagram, I have a link in my bio. If you just click that and then you click project files, it should take you to this Dropbox folder where I've got all the project files from the last sort of like live streams that I've done. Most of them are in 2023, but if we just click 2024, Jan 2024, you can now download the project file, and it's the exact thing we're going to make today. So feel free to check that out. And if you've missed or you want to see all the other tutorials or live streams that I've done, then that's just on the tutorials. I'm throwing them in a playlist. So yeah, you can check those out as well. It's just on the Maxon Training Team YouTube channel, as will this one be. Okay, cool. So let's get into it. Let's get into what we're going to be doing. So feel free to follow along. It's going to be really nice, and it's quite a simple setup, and I'm just going to explain it nice and slow. If you have any questions for me, then let me know in the chat. If you could help me out by just writing question at the start or Q, because it's just me here today, so I'm going to be looking after the chat as well as talking to you, as well as showing you some stuff in Cinema 4D and Redshift. Okay. So we're going to start off just by creating that shape, but it's really, really simple. We're just going to grab ourselves a cube, and we're going to make it 100 by 1 by 100. So this is the shape that our air bubble is going to be. And if I go NB, so that's a shortcut to then show the segments or what we call the shading lines, but really it's going to show you the topology or the segments that make up your object or your mesh. And if you've seen any of my streams before, you'll know my most common phrase is, when it comes to simulation, topology, subdivisions are really, really important. Having too low, we won't be able to get a nice kind of smooth sim. Too high, we risk slowing our machine down and slowing our hardware down, and that's not what we want when we're constantly iterating. So just as a quick heads up, I'm on a M3 Mac, but all my streams last year were on an M1. Okay, so let's have a little look at some segments. So inside of here, we just want to add 50 segments and 50 segments. So on the X and the Z or the Z axis, we want 50 by 50. So this is what we have at the moment. And I'm actually just going to add a fillet as well. And it's just going to add a bevel on the edge. So let's add the fillet and let's change that subdivision to 1. So this is our setup for our little air bubble. And it looks something like this. And you're probably thinking, it's looking a little bit low res. That's fine because we can up-res all this stuff later on. We just want to be working relatively low to get an idea of our sim, but we don't want to be too low or too high just yet. Okay, so now it's a case of creating that line of them. And the way that we can do that, again, nice and simply, is we can just add it to a cloner. And so if you hold the Option key and click the tool that you want or the object that you want, then it's going to make it a child of it. So we can see here the cloner and the cube. The cube's now child of the cloner, and we now have this 3x3 grid. So what we could do, we could create like a bubble wrap grid and do like 5x5 and move them closer. But for me, I want to keep it really similar to the original inspiration. So for that, we just need to go to linear mode. And we can see at the moment it's going up on the y-axis, but we actually don't want that. We want it to be going along the x-axis. So we can just increase our count to 4. And then inside of our mode, we have per step. And this is the distance between each of our clones. And at the moment, we can see it's on the y-axis. So we can just zero that out. And then we can just move it on the x-axis. And so because I know my cubes are 100 by 100, because we just set that up, I can say, okay, I need the per step or the distance between each axis or the middle of each clone to be 100 centimeters. And now they're going to be perfectly together. So from here, what we want to do is we actually want this to be a single object or a single mesh. Because at the moment, if we animate them, they're going to be seen as separate clones. So what we can do is we can come into our generators and we can just add a connect. Again, just hold the Option key. And now we've connected them together and we need to make sure weld is enabled. So I'm going to leave that checked on. Okay, so we've made the shape. So nice and quickly, in a matter of minutes, we've been able to make this shape. But what we want to do now, or what I want to do, is because I like to add some like logos and textures sometimes to my like renders, I like to do a unwrap so I can then create a UV unwrap template that I can then bring into Photoshop, and then I can add some logos and some text and some cool elements to that. If you don't want to do that, then this step, you can sort of like ignore this next sort of like 5 to 8 minute step, and we can go straight to the Vertex map. But for now, I'm going to show you how we can do this and how we can unwrap this. So the first thing we want to do is, in order to be able to unwrap and create a UV tag, we actually need this to be a single editable object. And so to do that, we need to right click on our connect, and then we go current state to object. And now what we have is we have the original setup, and now we have this editable single object. So let's just hide the original. So we've got Option G, just to put that inside of a group or inside of a null. And I'm just going to call this my original. So any takeaway from this stream, like the main thing you want to remember is when you're kind of baking an object down, I would recommend keeping the original. Like in this case, it's fine because we could recreate this really, really quickly. But if it was a bigger setup, you might want to keep the original just to save you that time if you need to go back. And let's just hide that. So we have our connect and we have our UV tag. So now when we go into UVedit, we can see in our UV editor window, we have this sort of like UV tile. But we don't actually want that one. So I'm just going to delete that, just delete that tag. And I'm going to go set UV from projection. And for this, what I'm going to do, I'm actually going to use the auto UVing algorithm. So we have 3 different types, 3 different algorithms here. And based on the fact that I've done this before and I've practiced this, I know that the cubic algorithm is going to give me the kind of UV tile that I need and the UV unwrap that I want. So if I apply that, we can now see that we've created this UV tile and this UV unwrap. And so I do want to kind of quickly say, this isn't like a one-click wonder, unfortunately. It depends on what you are creating the UV for. It depends obviously on the shape of your mesh. Like, this is a really simple shape. It's 4 cubes. That's sort of it. And so we know when we do our unwrap that it's relatively simple. So unfortunately, yeah, it's not a one-click wonder, but we did a demystifying series on the Maxon Trainer Team YouTube channel a couple of months ago. So if you want to know more about UVing, I'd recommend that. I can link that at the end as well if people want. So we've got our UV tile that to me is fine and is usable for what I want to be doing. And now what I want to do, I want to create a template of this that I can then bring into Photoshop, and I can start to add things like logos, text, like cool patterns that will then map exactly where they need to map on my mesh. So what we need to do is we go to File, New Texture, call it something. So I'll call it Jan Live UV Test. Choose your width and height. So this will be the resolution of that tile, of that texture. So I'm just going to go 4K. And then this background color that's not too important for now. And I can just hit OK. And we can now see it's added that texture to here. Now what we need to do is we need to convert our UV into a template. So under Layer, we're going to go Create UV Mesh Layer. And then we're going to go to File, Save Texture As. And because I'm going to be doing this stuff in Photoshop, I'm going to save it as a PSD file. I'm going to go, OK. And then I'm just going to save this in a folder. And the way that this looks, if I open it in Photoshop, so this is what we have just created. So we have our UV layer, and then we have our background, which is just that gray element, which we don't really need. But the UV layer is what's important. Because then what we can do, this is going to be really handy when it comes to adding some cool texturing later on. But before we move on from that, the way that I work with this, and this might be a hack, this might not be, it's just the way that I like to work. Basically, my plan with this is to be able to add those different elements over the top. So if we take a look at this, I've just placed these little logos and these little kind of additional extras on top of it based on this texture UV layer. And so I need to know which tile is representing which square here. So the quick way I do this is I just go to my polygon mode and I click this top one. So this first square on top, I now know is this square on my UV tile. And then I've got my second one, I've got my third one, and I've got my fourth one. And then what I do, I come back into Photoshop and I just number them 1, 2, 3, and 4. So I now know when it comes to the texturing side of things, these are the tiles that I want, and this is the way around things are going to be. So we'll come back to this later on. But for now, that is how you would unwrap that. And now we can get into the simulating side of things. So if you're watching the recording and you're not too worried about the auto unwrap and you want to skip that part, this is the moment you want to come to now when we talk about Vertex Maps. Okay, so let's just call this our air bubble. And now what we want to do is we want to set up a vertex map growth, and the growth is going to control our inflation. So it's going to control our simulation. And so the way that we can do that is we can just right click on our air bubble, and then we can search, I can just type in vertex and add a vertex map tag. The main thing here is if you didn't do the auto unwrap part, you can still do this on the procedural setup. Just put your vertex map on your connect and then follow every step that we do now. So with a vertex map, in case you are a beginner and relatively new to Cinema 4D, pretty much what a vertex map is, everything that is 100% red, so as it is now, is a weight value of 0%, therefore is a value of 0. So when it's in simulation terms, there would be no simulation occurring in this red area. everything that is in yellow is a weight value of 100%, therefore is a 100% value of simulation, and it's where the simulation will be taking place. What we want to do is we want to control and animate a growth from the left to the right. And we can do that by using fields. So in here, we can see we have this use fields option. So I can just check that. I'm going to delete this default freeze layer. We don't need that because we're going to set up the most simple and basic growth ever. And that's going to be with a linear field. So in here, we can just click the linear field. And we can now see we're able, by moving our linear field, to go from a value of 0% to 100%. We're going from red to yellow with a gradient in the middle. So what we're going to do here is my linear field is actually a little bit too big. So I want to shrink this down a little bit to about 25 centimeters. And now my animation is going to go from left to right. But what we want is we want it to go from red to yellow because we want it to be not simulated first and then simulated. So that needs to be red, then yellow. Whereas at the moment, it's the wrong way round. So what we can do in the direction, at the moment, it's positive X. Let's just go negative X. And now when I animate it from left to right, we can see we're getting red to yellow, and it's fixed that problem. So let's increase my timeline a little bit. So I have 30 frames per second in my project. So let's go maybe like 210 frames, 210. So I've got a 7-second animation. And then on frame 0, so down the bottom here, I can see I'm on frame 0. I'm going to pull this back. So everything is going to be 100% red. And then in my linear field, the only thing I need to keyframe is this position here. So let's maybe go a little bit further over. So this is all we want to keyframe. So I'm going to hit that. And we can now see we've got a little keyframe here. And then at the end, let's say I want my growth to end after 150 frames. So after 150 frames, I want everything to be simulated. So I'm going to put it all the way over until everything is 100% yellow. And I'm going to set a keyframe again. So this is what we've just set up. With a linear field, a vertex map, and 2 keyframes, a nice, simple growth that we can then use to control our simulation. Okay. Let's just save that quickly. So now what we want to do is we just want to set up that inflation. So we can now start working with our balloon tag. So on my air bubble, so this is the object that I'm going to simulate, I'm just going to right click. I'm going to come down to simulation tags and we're going to add a balloon tag. Okay. So straight away, this is now a simulated object. So if I now press play, we can now see it's simulated and it's falling through our viewport, through our sky. So the thing is, we don't actually want that. And that's because by default, we have gravity in our scene. So we actually just want to disable gravity. So if I hit Command D or Control D, if you're on Windows, so Command D, we can come into our project settings and then we have simulation settings. And what we want is the scene settings in here. And so now we can see we've got gravity by default. So let's just zero that out. So now we shouldn't have any problems with anything falling through the sky. And then another thing we do want to change here. So don't come off of this window yet, because we do want to adjust our scene scale. So scene scale is basically the average size of the objects that are being simulated in your scene. And you're probably thinking, oh, but Ellie, it's 100 by 100 centimeters. So wouldn't this work? It would, but we've only got a 1 centimeter depth, or in this case, height. We've got 1 centimeter height. And so I found through sort of like just exploring and testing things that pulling this down to 5 centimeters gave us a much more accurate simulation. And it will just help with your constraints, which are your settings for your points on your simulated objects, as well as your simulation settings themselves. So now what we can do is we can come into our balloon tag settings and we can start to play around with overpressure and expansion time. So to find the best way of inflating something is just exploring these two settings and finding a good combination of the two together. So just going to talk a little bit about them. Overpressure is used to control the volume of our object, of our shape, so by creating inflation. A value of 1 is a default value, so you're going to get natural or normal behavior. So if I just press play, we can see we're not really getting sort of like any inflating happening. And so a value of 2 is going to double that volume, and so on and so on and so on. So let's do a value of 10, because this is quite a thin, sort of deflated air bubble that we have going on at the moment. And I can press play. And so if I come to the side, you should see this a lot better. Okay, so we can start to see we're getting some inflation going on, but it's not really what we had in mind. So maybe we go a little bit higher, something like 25, until we get to a point where we are happy with how these are looking. Okay, so 25 doesn't look too bad. So we'll leave it on that for now. Again, we can come back and we can play with these settings. They are not set in stone. And so now what we can do is we can take a look at the expansion time. And so what you'll notice is when you then adjust or modify overpressure, which in our case we have, it's no longer the default, expansion time then controls the time in which the inflation happens. And this is a uniform inflation at the moment. So over 30 frames, so over 1 second, it is going to hit that overpressure of 25. So you have to be careful of low expansion time values. If everything happens too quickly, then we can get issues and collisions, and we can get some things that we don't want to see. And so this is okay. We're getting the inflation. Cool. The expansion time is fine for now. But what we want is we set up that vertex map to control the inflation. So what we need to do is we actually need to take that vertex map tag, so our vertex map tag here, and we're going to drag and drop it into this map section. So we drag and drop that in there. And now what should happen is where the vertex map grows, so should the overpressure. Okay. And everything's gone a little bit crazy. Everything's gone a little bit messed up. And so now this is where it becomes a combination of the expansion time. So the trouble is now, where the expansion time is only set to 30 frames, by the time the vertex map growth then happens, it's kind of already at 30 frames. So we're getting a pressure of 0 to 25 very, very quickly, and it's causing these issues. So what we want to do is we're going to counteract it with the expansion time. We're going to increase that. So because my vertex map growth is about 150 frames, so I'm going to match that. I'm going to match it, and it should then all be okay. So now we press play, and now we can see we're getting a much, much better inflation taking place. So a few things I do want to talk about here. If you're happy with this, then wonderful, that's great. But if you find it's all a bit too intense at the beginning, so you might find, oh, okay, as soon as my vertex map comes in, it's all a little bit too, there's too much pressure going on. So how do we counteract this? How do we fix this? Well, what we can do is we can come into mix animation. Let's just say this again. We come into mix animation and we can use the with force option. And what with force does, it's going to control the movement and the inflation by adding some force strength. And so depending on this strength, it will set a corresponding force that will act on our simulated points, so the animated points. It will try and hold them a bit more in place, similar to how follow position and follow rotation works on rigid body or bullet dynamics systems. So we don't want to go too high with this. I'll go 0.5 just to demonstrate how this will work. So we can now see it's sort of holding them in their original shape, but we're losing that inflation. So we could come down a bit further. And what we could do is we can also then add that vertex map inside of here. So now we can press play. And it just sort of slows it down a little bit and holds that back together. And we then still get this, we get this nicer force or this nicer inflation. What you can do though, if you find you're not really sure, you don't really like that look, but you still want to find a way of reducing the intensity or the force of the simulation, then what we can do is we can go back into our project settings, so Command or Control D. Under our simulation tab this time, we have something called damping. And damping is going to dampen your simulation and your movement. It's kind of like the idea of it happening underwater. So we could maybe go, a little goes a long way here. So if maybe go something like 5%. We can see how it's sort of like dampened our scene. So we're getting some issues here. We're getting some like problems with collisions, but that can be fixed with our collision passes. And so that is another way that you could then do that. Maybe we want to pull that back down. I quite liked the with force. So let's go back to there. And let's see. Let's see how this looks. Play this through. Okay. So I'm quite content with that. I'm quite happy with that. Again, now you know how these settings work, you can kind of play around and find the inflation and the style of simulation that you're happy with. But for me, this is good for now. So once I'm then happy with this, I want to bake it down as an Alembic. And so once I bake it down as an Alembic, I'll then have access to the baked version. And then also we can do some interesting time remapping tricks. And so what we're going to do is on the object that is simulated, so this air bubble, I'm going to right click, I'm going to go bake as Alembic, and then you'll see down the bottom how quickly this works, because again, we're still working low res. And so it's going to bake all this down, including all our Vertex Map data. And here we go. We have the Alembic. So I'm just going to copy it. I'm going to paste it into just a fresh new scene. This isn't a necessity. It's just something that I like to do. And if we just match that timeline again, so 210 frames. Now what we have is we have the baked version. So I can scrub along my timeline and it is baked down. Or I can just play it and we can see how this looks. Okay, so inside my Alembic, the cool thing about this is my Vertex map is also now baked. So we can play around with some cool texturing stuff if we wanted to. Right, cool, yeah. So let's have a look at the Alembic. Let's take a look, let's move this down. So here we have our Alembic, it's connected to our path of our file, we have our scale, and then we have this animation option. So the first of all, one of the cool things we can do is we can create a slow-mo effect by just pulling down the speed. So we can pull down the speed to 50%, and I can play this through, and we can get a slow-mo version of it. Okay, so that's one thing we can do. We can loop and we can do a ping pong. So ping pong is going to animate it forwards and then backwards. But another thing we can do is we can actually drop down this time remapping option, and we have a remap curve. And the remap curve is going to allow us to control the remapping, or basically the time over the entire timeline that things take place. So if I just command click, I can then start to play around. So what this means is it means it will start slow and then it will go faster. So if we play this through, so it starts slow and then it picks up its speed. So that could be another way of getting away with that sort of that intense force at the beginning. You could just slow it down in your time remap and then fix it that way. And we even have some presets in here where once they load, we can sort of do a smooth version of what we just set up. So it's going to start slow and it's going to gradually speed up and hit its max. So that's sort of what we have going on. So some cool stuff when you bake it down as an Alembic that you can do with your time remapping or your speeds. Let's just reset that to the default and just leave everything as it is for now. Right, okay, so Let me know if you have any questions, by the way, on any stuff that I've gone through. Feel free to just drop them in the chat. I'm keeping an eye on it on this screen whilst also looking at this one. And so that is as you know, challenging or as hard as the simulation is. We have made it now, and so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at creating the comp. We're going to create some Redshift lighting, and then we're going to look at some texturing. So we're doing well for time. We're doing well. The plan is to be under the hour. So if you join later on, yeah, that's my plan, and I think we can do it. So again, any questions, just drop in the chat, and I will keep an eye on those. So first things first, what we want to do is we want to set up our comp. So inside of my output in my render settings up here, I'm just going to change the width and height. And so I'm going to go 2000 by 2000. And the reason for this, so this is all now your personal preference, your artistic preference, however you want to set up your comp is down to you. I go 2K by 2K. It's a little bit of laziness. I do a lot of stuff with socials. So this gives me a 1:1 ratio. I'm able to do a 16 by 9, so 1920 by 1080. I'm also then able to do 9 by 16 for like Instagram reels and stories and stuff like that. So I like a 2K output, a 2K resolution, so I can then play around with some of those things if I need to. And then when I start working in Redshift, because I like to iterate really quickly, these are my settings that I will change whilst I am just setting up my lighting and setting up my texturing. These are by no means my final render settings, so please do not think that. So I will go bucket quality low. Progressive passes, I set really low to 128, because they don't need to be 1024. Because again, when I'm iterating quickly, I want my render view to be really nice and snappy. And then in my system, I can go to 256 for my bucket size. And now we can just open up our render view and we can put that in there. So now when I kick this off, if you look down the bottom here, the progressive passes relate to this. It's a progressive renderer. So now every time I move this around, it's just going to update really, really quickly and be really snappy because it's just got those 128 passes, which is exactly what we want. Okay, so before we get into the rest of the comp, so the camera and the lighting and that, I'm just going to take a quick look at a couple of questions. So Jermaine was wondering, can you also use a Boolean in this setup? So would that be for combining the elements together? So a Boolean is more if you're kind of trying to cut an object out of another object. So I don't know if I'd necessarily use that, if that's what your question means. If it's relating to building the shape, then I perhaps wouldn't do a Boolean for that. But if that's not what you mean, then just let me know. And another one from Matthew, can you keyframe the overpressure time frame so it starts longer at the beginning and then goes back down to 150 so the beginning isn't so extreme? So yes, you could keyframe the overpressure. So the 150 was the expansion time. So let's go back to this quickly. Let's go into there. So yes, you could keyframe the overpressure over time. But the way that I believe overpressure works is it's kind of like a force at the beginning, and then it kind of will simmer and slow over time. But yes, you could definitely try keyframing those elements and see if that works for you. Let me just turn that down. So actually, there was one thing that I didn't do. So this is the joys. Do you know what? This is the joys of live streaming. There's a big thing that I didn't do. So let me cut back actually to this original setup. So Matthew, your question kind of has triggered me to remember something. So I'm just going to delete this Alembic, and I'm going to delete this Alembic. I'm going to keep this scene anyway as it is. But what I didn't do was I then didn't come into my surface constraints. And this is going to control the look of your geometry in your simulation. It's going to control the rigidity or the bendiness of your cloth. It can control the stretch of it. And so I have completely bypassed a massive part of this. So apologies, everyone. So yeah, what we'd want to do after we set up our overpressure and our expansion time, we want to come into our surface and we want to start to play around with our constraints to get a better looking sim. So for this, what we're going to do, so bendiness is sort of like the rigidity of our cloth or our strict constraints between our points. So if we go MB, what this is going to do, it's going to be the points, how much they can bend from one another or how much they can't. So if we go a low value, they'll stay nice and rigid. If we go a high value, they will bend. And then what we have is our stretchiness. So every other point, it's how far that's going to be allowed to stretch between them. And so these are really, really important. And I cannot believe I forgot them. So what we're going to do is we're going to increase our bendiness to something like 100. Again, understanding these settings comes with just playing and exploring and seeing what works for you in your simulation. And then maybe we'll do a thickness. So thickness is the collision distance for our points. So something like 1 centimeter will work fine for this. And so now this should look a little bit different and it should actually look a lot better. So let's go play. So it's no longer baked. I deleted that Alembic. And so now we just have a much smoother looking inflation. And then an extra thing that we can do is we can increase the target length. So the target length is going to be a way of increasing the size or the amount of geometry, and it can help to really create these nice additional wrinkles in this setup. So we can do the opposite as well with target length. So if you want something to tighten round a simulated object, you can decrease the target length. So what we want to do for this is we're going to go 110. So we don't want to go too high, just want a little bit of an increase. And then again, I want to use my Vertex Map because I don't want it to increase in size immediately. I want it to increase in size as my Vertex Map grows. So now let's play through. And we should now get some of these really cool extra little wrinkles in here. You might now find that increasing the overpressure will be a bit more beneficial. So again, it's just a combination of lots of different things working together. So we can now see actually, as I've increased that overpressure, this is when some other issues start to occur. So we get some collisions going on, and if you get some jittering, you can increase your smoothing iterations. So now we should hopefully get some, just a much nicer looking simulation. Perfect. Okay, let's rebake this. Let's just rebake that as an Alembic. And it shouldn't take too long. And then we're going to bring that back in. So yeah. I blame the fact that it's my first live stream of 2024 that I completely forgot a very important part. So yeah, thank you to Matthew for your question, because it kind of made me remember that I didn't do these things. Okay, so let's now copy our new Alembic and paste it into our scene. So now we've got that same thing going on. We have our baked down version. And now we can start to add and incorporate some Redshift things. We can add that plastic texture, and we can start to then look at our UV tile that we did earlier. So first things first, let's just set up our composition by creating a camera with maybe something like a focal length of 100. Maybe go something, let's just find like a nice look. So we can start to add some lighting, and then let's open up our Redshift render view. Okay. So this is where we're starting. This is our starting point, and we can begin to just play around with some lighting. So first things first, when I start to work with lighting, is I always add a dome light just to create some nice ambient lighting in my scene. And so we're going to add a dome light, and I'm just going to switch off the background. So inside my dome light, I'm just going to check that. And then what I like to do a lot of the time is I am a huge fan of Cinema 4D's asset browser. So it gets updated every month, and the models and the textures and the materials that you can use are actually really, really great. And so I love to use them on my projects, not only because I think they're great, but it also allows me to then share everything with you and share the full project file without having any worries. So open this up and I can just search HDR. And then I'm a big fan of these HDR lighting setups. So in here, I'm just going to drag and drop that into my texture input. And then we can just sort of rotate this round until we get a look that we're quite happy with. So let's see, maybe something like this. So we're just bringing out some of these nice wrinkles. And I'm not too worried that it's low res at the moment. We can fix this later on. So maybe something like this. And then what we can do is we can look at adding some area lights into our scene. So my quick trick is I always love to add a null. And I'm just going to reposition this slightly where my focus point is going to be in my comp, which is sort of this middle or this second bubble here. So this is my target. And now I can add in an area light. And in my area light, I can just use the drop down to add a target tag, and I can use my null as my target. So now as I move around, it's always going to focus on that target. So let's just resize this light. Maybe we'll make it a little bit smaller, something like this. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to just bring out these wrinkles and create some of these harder shadows just by using this light here. So we can start to get some shadows here. What we can do is a way of creating nice, creative, hard shadows is by pulling down the spread value. What the spread value is going to do is the lower the spread, the more direct and spotlight my light's going to be, but it's also going to become more intense. So we then need to bring down our intensity. So if I sort of start to pull this down, you can see that we're getting these hard shadows now. We're really bringing out some of those wrinkles. But again, the intensity is too high. And sometimes when I'm playing around with lighting and I haven't got my textures set up, because that's my workflow, is I do most of my lighting first, I then do textures and I come back and tweak my lighting. So we can actually go into Claymode in my render view. And it's just a nicer way of then starting to play around with lighting. Then I'm just going to duplicate this light. So this is sort of just the way that I set up my lighting. Again, this could be a nice starting point for you, but however you like to work and the kind of lighting aesthetic that you like is entirely down to you. It's sort of like an artistic preference, really. And so let's just create some additional, let's bring out some of the lights here so we can just sort of switch off our dome light and just see how things start to look. So again, just bring up some of those shadows in these wrinkles, but maybe not too much. Maybe go down a little bit. And then finally, what I want to do is I want to create a rim light on the edge. And so I'm going to come all the way up to here when they're fully sort of inflated. I'm going to create a third light. I'm going to put it on the back here, and I'm just going to switch these off for now. And then let's just sort of make these a little bit bigger. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create a rim light just on these edges here. So maybe we can pull that down. And now we can see we're starting to get this nice rim light here. And we can just pull that intensity down as well, just to bring out some of these edges. And with everything together, this is kind of what we have going on. So let's just pull this back. Something a little bit like this. And so this is the lighting setup we have going on. And if we come out of Claymode, at the moment, it looks quite intense. But again, it's because we haven't got any textures in. Okay, so now what we want to do is a quick way of adding just a background color. That one way that I do it is sometimes I'll add a plane and I'll add a texture to that plane. But if you just want a flat color in the background, the way that you can do that is you can just throw in a dome light. Under the details tab, you want to make sure that it's not lighting your scene. So what we want to do is we just want to zero out the ray contribution for diffuse. And then back in the object, we can just come in and we can then choose a color here if we want to. So let's just go sort of like a dark gray for now, just so you can see things nice and visible. On the original, I went with sort of like a mid-gray background. Okay, so we're now at the stage where most of our lighting set up. We're quite content with how it's looking. And now I need to look at creating that plastic texture and then look at that UV texture that I made as well. Because again, once I've then added my materials, I'm probably going to want to come back, or I might want to come back and adjust my lighting, because all these things go hand in hand and different artists and designers work in different ways. Some will create their materials first and then do their lighting. Some will do their lighting and then create their materials, because they all go hand in hand. So if I add a dark material to my object, it's going to absorb my light and therefore make things darker. If I have a bright and a light material color, then it's going to create more light bouncing and therefore create a brighter looking scene. So now let's get to that plastic material. So if we just sort of have a quick look at this is the material we're going to create. And I had a comment on Instagram about someone saying that they find it quite challenging to create plastic materials. And I'm with you. And I'm kind of I'm going to admit something to you all now. So inside the asset browser, if you search the word plastic and you go to materials and scroll down, this is the exact texture that I used, a plastic wrap material from the asset browser. So I'm going to double click that, and it's added into my scene here. And I can just throw that on my air bubble. And now we have a really great looking plastic texture. But let's have a look at it. Let's break it down and let's see exactly what's going on, because as it is right now, it doesn't actually work for the scene, and I'll explain why. So inside my plastic wrap, this is what's going on, and there actually isn't a lot going on. So this bit here is really just your ability to control the size over the object. So we can go bigger or we can go smaller in centimeters. And so we're not too fussed about that for now. What I'm fussed about is this bit here. So when you first create a Redshift material, if you're experienced, you will know that you get a standard material node and you get an output. These are the two nodes that you will get when you create a material. So just to break this down, so for those of you who would love to know how this plastic material was created, I'm going to show you the exact base properties now and how it was done. So if we just take a look at our base properties, we have a base color of 100% white. And then we have a weight value of 0.5. So we don't have a 100% weight value. What this is doing is it's going to be mixing with the other weight values, for example, of transmission. Coming down, we then have our reflection, color, and weight. Again, pretty default, set to 1 and set to white. Then we have something controlling the roughness. So we have a texture map controlling the roughness. We'll look at that in just a sec. And then we have an IOR value. So when it comes to refractive objects or translucent objects, an IOR is really, really important. So if it's for glass, it's for diamond, if it's for plastic, you do want to make sure you have a physically accurate IOR for that. Then we can come down and then we have transmission. Again, transmission color is 100% white. And then we have a weight value of 0.75. So we haven't got a fully transmissive or transparent material, sorry. We have this mixing with the base color. And then we have extra roughness. So this value is really cool. So extra roughness is basically what it does is it's going to counteract the reflection roughness. And effectively, this value is now your refraction or your transmission roughness. That's what this setting does. And as you can see, we can go into negative and positive values. And the only other thing in our base properties that's changed is in my geometry, we have a bump map and we have the thin walled setting enabled. So it gives the impression that my object and my geometry has no thickness. Okay, so now working backwards, we can then see we have a roughness map, and that is controlling the varying roughness values on here. So if you just solo that, you can see how it's projecting on my object. So a little bit of information about this roughness map, just in case it's useful. Everything on a roughness map that is 100% white, so in our case, we don't actually have that, it represents a roughness value of 1, therefore will be very rough on your object. If there is 100% black, that is a roughness value of 0, therefore it's going to be really shiny, it's going to be not rough at all. And everything in the middle, so all these grey parts, are going to be varying roughness values. That's sort of what the texture map is doing. And then this is plugged into a triplanar. So when I solo the triplanar, you'll see, oh, okay, it looks like it's now projecting a lot better than it was before. And this is because the triplanar ignores UVs and it's going to map this texture correctly or more accurately. But there's always a but. The trouble is when working with a triplanar on animated objects is it will cause the object to move through the texture map. So very similar to when you work with Maxon noises and you animate, sometimes the object will move through the noise and so it looks like the texture's swimming. That's the exact case when working with a triplanar. So if I leave it on right now and leave this set up as it is with a triplanar and I then render this, the texture will be sticking where it is and the object will be moving through it. So it will look like the texture's moving and that's not what we want. So to counteract this, what we want to do is because we did our auto UV unwrap, we actually just want to do some manual remapping. So let's maybe go something like 8 and 4. And so now what we can see is by manually remapping and retiling this ourselves, we've been able to create the same thing that the triplanar did because of our auto unwrap. So now we can plug this in, we can bypass our triplanar, and we've now fixed any problems here. And we do want to do the same with our normal map and our height map. So our height map here, because I've done this before, I know that I just want to remap this as a 10 by 10 tile. And so now we can see that that's projecting far better than it was before. We can plug that in, bypass our triplanar, and the normal map is very similar. So if we sort of look here, the normal map is very similar to this one, to our height map. So we're just going to go 10 by 10 again and plug that in there. Okay, so now what we've done is we've just sort of tweaked this a little bit, and now we're going to get a not swimming version of that. We don't need our triplanar. We've fixed these issues. So before we get to adding those little logos on top, something I want to talk about. I'm going to head back into Claymode. I'm going to come out of here and I'm just going to zoom in. So we can see that we're working with a relatively low res object here. So one way we know how to up-res that is to just throw it into a subdivision surface. And now we get really nice smooth geometry. But there's actually a way that we can do this at render time with Redshift instead of having to worry about having high-res models in our viewport. So if you want to work this way, by all means, totally fine. You can work with subdivision surface. But let me show you the way that we can do this in Redshift. So just for now, because I'm sort of tempting fate right here, let me just save this to Channel Live Test. Cool, there we go. And now let's just right click on my object. And I'm just going to type RS and I'm going to add the Redshift object tag. So the Redshift object tag, you may know that this is where we add and control our displacement. But the thing we want to look at first of all is actually this tessellation. And so tessellation is subdivision. So I'm going to enable this. And then now we can see we've now got that smooth version very similar to when we use that subdivision surface. There is a but though when it comes to this. Again, like there is a little bit of a caveat that we want to take a look at. So because in my material, we're working with displacement, we want to make sure that we enable our displacement as well. But now we can kind of see it's not really looking how you'd expect it to look. And this is because now there isn't enough geometry, there isn't enough subdivisions to warrant our displacement. So if I just sort of come out of here, if I re-enable my subdivision surface, this is sort of how it should be looking. So this is then a much more accurate looking displacement. We still have some problems here, but this is kind of what we would be hoping for. And so how do we do this inside of the object tag so it's done at render time and still know that we don't have to use the subdivision surface? Well, this is where we come into our minimum edge length and our maximum subdivisions. This is where we can play around with our tessellation and with our subdivision. And so this minimum edge length, I'm just going to pull that down, put it down to 1. And now we can see we are getting that far more accurate displacement whilst also doing our tessellation, but all of this is being done at render time. So again, we haven't had to worry about using the subdivision surface. And then maybe we could pull down our displacement scale if you find it's a little bit too intense, something like a 0.5 scale. And now we can come back out of our clay mode, and then we can just see that this is working and looking a little bit better. Okay, so we're getting pretty close. The final step here, so we've got 5 minutes. The final step here is just to add those finishing touches. So those little extra bits on top, like our logos. So if we come back into Photoshop, so remember this is where we did our auto UV unwrap. We created our UV layer. We've now brought that into Photoshop. We now know which of these tiles we need to put our logos and our textures where, and we know where it's going to map. So if I just switch those off, this is what I ended up creating. So if I just sort of like come a bit closer, just some really simple logos. I'm a big fan of Nike and Adidas. So if you've seen anything on my social media, you probably see that I'd like to throw their logo on a lot of things when it comes to simulation. It just looks cool. And I like to do it. I like the aesthetic. So I created this. So this is my UV tile. And so I know these are going to map on those certain tiles or those certain bubbles in Cinema 4D. In order to save this, what we need to do is we actually want to disable the UV mesh layer and disable the background. If we leave the background on, it's going to render as gray and then as black. What we want to do, we want to use this sort of like and use the alpha layer to just add the logos on top. So we turn that off and then we just save this as a PNG. PNG is important. If it's a JPEG, we can't split out the alpha. So save it as a PNG. And it should look something like this. So this is what we want to create and this is what we need. Now we come back into Cinema 4D. Let's give ourselves a little bit of a top view just so we can see everything a bit better. We're going to create a new material and we're just going to throw that on top. And it's going to overtake the previous material apart from the displacement. And this is because we have what's called material stacking. Open the new material. Then we're just going to throw in that PNG. So this is that PNG file that we just saved out of Photoshop. And then what we need the color splitter. So the color splitter node, we can plug that into the input, and then the alpha, so we're going to split out the alpha, and we're going to plug that into my opacity. And so now you can see it's removed that alpha, and the rest is just our logos. So just to make it really visible for you all, inside of my standard material, I can still control the style material. So we could have like metal logos, we could have black gloss, we could have sort of rough white textures, we could have any color that you want. And so in here, let me just make it nice and visible for you and just make them maybe black and then add some roughness. And so now if we just sort of come into here, we can see based on our UV layer that we've been able to add those different elements using our Photoshop file. So we can see how they really perfectly map onto here. Let's cut back into Cinema 4D. And so this is pretty much the process of how to create that air bubble inflation and how we did that plastic material as well as those logos on top. And also we had a little look at how we could remap that Alembic as well to create more of that slow-mo effect that then it speeds up until the end. And we did it in under an hour. So that was the aim. That was the goal, is to sort of keep this stream to pretty much an hour. But that being said, does anyone have any questions before we then look at kind of wrapping up? So I'm just having a quick look through. So Halal Studio was wondering about liquids and grains. So yeah, that's definitely something that can be looked at. I think the trouble is, and I'm going to be kind of like honest here, there isn't a liquid or particle system inside of Cinema 4D. So this new cloth system is incredible and it's powerful and it's great, and we can create really kind of amazing things like this and simulated objects now at high resolution. But I think there's still some way to go when it comes to working with liquids. So yeah, I'm all for that though, and I'm with you there on that one. So really quickly as well, I showed this at the start, and so I thought I'd show this at the end. This is based off of this Houdini exploration by Vinicius, who is a designer at Man vs Machine. So, you know, shout out to him. This is an incredible piece. And I wanted to create a version or see if I could create a similar version inside of Cinema 4D. And yeah, we sort of ended up with this as a final render. That's just a top view, and then we have a sort of slightly close-up version. And the project file is available for you all to download. So it's actually available inside of the YouTube description, but if you want to grab it through Instagram, or if you want to grab some other project files, then again, literally just go onto my Instagram, which is itwaselly, hit the link in the bio. We then have project files and tutorials. So project files, if we open that up, here's all the project files that you guys can have and you can download. It includes most assets and most projects. In 2024, Jan 2024, this entire thing, this is also lit and textured inside of Redshift. So it's not just the scene, it's everything. And then if you want to see some other tutorials, my Alexa just went off. You can go to tutorials, and this is just a playlist that I throw all of these monthly live streams on. So feel free to check those out. And then, as always, you can check out all the other great stuff on the Train Team YouTube channel. So all the stuff that the team do gets uploaded onto here inside their own playlists. And so you can definitely check those things out. So as always, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for being part of my January live stream, first live stream of 2024. They will be the final Thursday of every month. That is the plan. So I hope you have enjoyed it. I'll be excited to see if you make things like this. If you do, just tag me on Instagram. Yeah, and have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. Have a good weekend if I don't see you before, and hopefully see you on another stream soon. So have a good one, everyone.